Ferrari's engineers couldn't believe what the data revealed after the Austin sprint qualifying. Lewis Hamilton had dragged the SF25 far beyond its mechanical comfort zone, and nothing illegal caused it. What they found inside his car shocked Maranello: precision driving that defied their own simulations. The result wasn't a victory on paper, but it proved something far greater. Hamilton's genius remains the benchmark of Formula One excellence. There are moments in Formula One when the stopwatch lies. On paper, Lewis Hamilton's 8th place in the Austin sprint qualifying seemed ordinary, even disappointing. But what the world didn't see, what Ferrari's engineers discovered hours later under the lights of the Circuit of the Americas, turned that modest result into something extraordinary. When they pulled the data from Hamilton's car, the numbers refused to make sense. They revealed stability where the car should have been unstable, tire wear where there should have been degradation, and downforce readings that didn't match the geometry of the SF25. Something had happened out there, something only Hamilton could have produced. Inside the Ferrari garage, engineers stared at the telemetry screens with the same disbelief that once greeted his early Mercedes laps in the rain. The ride height data was the first clue. The SF25, raised after the painful disqualification in China to avoid another plank wear violation, had no right to maintain such consistent aerodynamic balance. Yet Hamilton had done it. Through precision throttle control, millimetric steering corrections, and an uncanny sensitivity to load transfer, he had effectively stabilized airflow under the car, an aerodynamic miracle created by instinct, not software. The engineers called it impossible until they saw the onboard footage. Lap after lap, Hamilton was compensating for the car's nervous rear end with his own rhythm. He braked later but not harder, turned earlier but never forced the front end, carried speed through the apex while keeping the chassis flat. In doing so, he tricked the car into behaving as if it were lower than it really was. That subtle illusion restored part of the downforce Ferrari had sacrificed since the China debacle. It wasn't luck, nor desperation, it was art. And when the data overlays compared Hamilton's inputs to Leclerc's, the difference wasn't mechanical, it was human. By the time Ferrari debriefed that evening, the realization had sunk in. Hamilton hadn't just driven around the problem, he had rewritten it. His driving inputs created a new operational window for the SF25, one that the design department hadn't mapped. Every fluctuation of brake pressure, every modulation of steering angle, had produced patterns the engineers now wanted to replicate. What had begun as a disappointing qualifying became a case study in driver-induced performance, the kind of mastery only a few in history ever achieve. The astonishment grew when aerodynamicists recalculated the floor load data. The difference between simulation and reality was not marginal, it was dramatic. Hamilton had preserved plank wear by almost a third compared to projections. That meant he'd managed to drive faster and safer at the same time, a balance of aggression and control that defied logic. It was the kind of precision one expects from a machine, yet here it was, generated by a man in his 40s, still reading the behavior of a car better than the engineers who built it. Ferrari realized that day they weren't just working with a driver. They were collaborating with an engineer in racing boots. 4 months, Ferrari had been chasing a ghost, that elusive balance between legality and performance that the SF25 never seemed to hold for more than a handful of laps. Lower the car, and the underfloor plank would scrape itself into disqualification. Raise it, and the aerodynamic concept collapsed, leaving the rear end twitching like a nervous animal on the exit of every corner. The team had reached a point of paralysis, terrified of another post-race penalty yet frustrated by their own self-imposed caution. And in the middle of that mechanical tug-of-war stood Lewis Hamilton, a man who had built his legacy on understanding what a car wants to be, not just what it is. That weekend in Austin, the Circuit of the Americas exposed every crack in Ferrari's design philosophy. The track's hybrid nature, high-speed SEs, slow traction zones, and a long back straight demands flexibility. The SF25, however, is a car that only performs in a razor-thin window of perfection. Hamilton knew it the moment he left the garage on Friday. The car was floating through Sector 1, sliding in Sector 2, and gasping for stability through the long straights. Most drivers would have complained, but Hamilton didn't. Instead, he began studying it corner by corner, like a surgeon mapping the heartbeat of a patient on the edge of collapse. He adjusted his approach in ways that only a veteran could. He braked half a meter later into Turn 1, but feathered the pedal just enough to keep the nose calm. He used the camber of Turn 11 not to attack the apex, but to rotate the rear with gravity rather than throttle. And through the fast left-right sequences, he balanced the car using minute steering inputs so smooth that even the telemetry team mistook them for sensor noise. This wasn't just driving, it was communication. Every lap was a conversation between man and machine, where Hamilton listened to the car's fears and answered them with precision. When Ferrari's engineers compared his data to Leclerc's, the revelation was profound. The same car, same setup, same tires, yet Hamilton's lap-to-lap consistency was astonishing. He was losing less time in transient phases, managing lateral load transfer with a smoothness that the SF25 had never exhibited before. His skid block wear, the team discovered, was nearly 30% lower than the models had predicted. It meant one thing: through his technique alone, Hamilton had made the car more stable, more efficient, and more compliant without touching a single mechanical component. He had done with intuition what Ferrari couldn't do with simulation. Inside the engineering office that night, the tone shifted. What began as another disappointing qualifying debrief became a moment of self-reflection. For the first time, Ferrari staff realized that Hamilton's driving wasn't masking the car's flaws, it was redefining them. He had turned the SF25's weakness, its narrow operating window, into a precision tool he could manipulate. His 8th place suddenly looked heroic, a performance squeezed out of a chassis that had no business being near the top 10. And perhaps more importantly, he had given Ferrari something no computer could generate: a new data map for how to make the car breathe. For Hamilton, this was business as usual, another day in a career built on adaptation and resilience. But for Ferrari, it was a wake-up call. They had brought him on board hoping for a driver who could execute their ideas. What they got was a man capable of rewriting them. The problem was no longer just aerodynamic inefficiency or floor wear. The real issue was philosophical. Could Ferrari learn to trust Hamilton's instincts as much as he trusted his own? Because on that Friday night in Austin, they had seen enough to know that his 8th place was not a limitation of the driver, but a reflection of a team still learning to understand its greatest asset. In the quiet hours after qualifying, deep inside Ferrari's mobile engineering unit, the mood had changed from frustration to fascination. Every engineer huddled around the telemetry display, watching Hamilton's data traces as if deciphering a new language. They expected chaos: spikes of brake pressure, erratic throttle modulation, unstable steering corrections, the signs of a driver fighting a car that refused to behave. But the graphs told another story. Hamilton's inputs were clean, symmetrical, and rhythmic. It was as if he had imposed order upon the machine, forcing coherence where the aerodynamics had failed. What they were seeing wasn't survival driving, it was control of the highest order. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. His braking pattern through the first sector was unlike anything in Ferrari's database. Instead of relying on aggressive pedal pressure to stabilize the front end, Hamilton was using delicate deceleration phases to keep the airflow attached beneath the floor. Each microsecond of brake release corresponded with a measurable improvement in rear stability. By managing how the car transferred weight forward, he was effectively tuning the aerodynamics with his feet. That kind of synchronization between driver and chassis doesn't come from instinct alone, it comes from decades of mechanical understanding, from a man who still approaches racing like an engineer disguised as a driver. The most astonishing discovery came from his brake-by-wire system data. 4 months, Ferrari had struggled to prevent overheating in the Brembo discs, especially on circuits demanding heavy braking zones. Yet Hamilton's brake temperatures stayed remarkably consistent within a narrow band of thermal stability that Ferrari hadn't achieved since the car's launch. The engineers couldn't believe it. Hamilton was cooling the brakes while extracting more aerodynamic benefit. The explanation, they realized, was both simple and extraordinary. Through ultra-precise modulation of brake pressure, he maintained airflow continuity through the ducts, preventing heat spikes and preserving balance in corner entry. He had mastered a thermal rhythm that allowed the SF25 to perform above its design limits. One of Ferrari's aerodynamicists, speaking quietly during the post-session analysis, reportedly muttered the same sentence that later spread through the paddock. "He's driving the simulator in real life." It wasn't hyperbole. Hamilton's telemetry was so consistent that the engineers used his laps as a new reference standard, cleaner than any digital simulation they had run that week. Every corner, every straight, every phase of energy recovery was optimized through feel. It was a humbling revelation for a team that prided itself on precision modeling. The numbers said one thing, Hamilton's hands said another, and his hands were right. That night, Ferrari's senior engineers reran their aerodynamic maps using Hamilton's data as input. The results stunned them. By replicating his brake and throttle traces, the simulation showed a 3/10 gain in theoretical lap time purely from energy flow optimization. 3/10, achieved not through design updates or mechanical change, but through the intangible intelligence of a driver. For the first time since joining the team, Hamilton had not only driven the car, he had taught it. His laps became the new baseline for CFD and wind tunnel correlation. Maranello's machines would now try to imitate the intuition of one man. What made the moment even more powerful was the silence in which it unfolded. There were no headlines, no radio outbursts, no celebration. Just data, quiet, clinical, irrefutable data proving that Hamilton's feel for physics remained a force of nature. The engineers knew they were witnessing something that transcended numbers. A driver who could detect aerodynamic instability before a computer could measure it. They saw him not as a passenger inside the SF-25, but as part of its nervous system, reacting faster than the sensors themselves.